This is Tom, and you're listening to the Paperback Warrior Podcast.
Welcome to another edition of the Paperback Warrior Podcast. I'm your co-host, Eric. I'm going to bring on my colleague, Tom, here in just a moment. But first, before we get started with today's content, we wanted to bring up our pledge drive. We've been talking about this for a couple of weeks now. We need to make an appeal to you, the listener. We're getting great feedback on the podcast, and we're glad you're listening. We recognize that the sound quality on the show isn't quite where we want it to be. We've priced out a decent sound mixer, microphone package, and the recording equipment cost more than either of us can afford. So over the next few weeks, we're going to ask you, the listener, to donate money to the show for this very purpose. The show isn't really big enough to take ads, and honestly, it probably never will be. You don't want to listen to us trying to sell you a mattress. If you can't afford to donate, don't worry about it. We're just happy you're listening. However, if you can afford to donate any amount of money to the show, big or small, we promise to put the money right back into the podcast. You can donate through PayPal by directing your payment to paperbackwarrior@yahoo.com or by clicking on the donate link at our flagship site, paperbackwarrior.com. Thanks so much for your generosity. And let's get back to what we have on tap for today. Really, and I want to point this out just so people will realize this, but remember, paperbackwarrior.com has hundreds upon hundreds of reviews from the 40s through the 90s. Lots of paperback fiction for you to look through. There's going to be tags on the right-hand side of the screen to drill down to genres, titles, authors. And boy, do we love feedback. So if you want to drop us a line, paperbackwarrior@yahoo.com. We just recently realized that a ton of our emails were going into spam. So I'll apologize ahead of time for that. But we uncovered a wealth of feedback this past week. So we've been sorting through that. But guess what? Guess what today is, Tom?
What is today, Eric?
It's show number 10. That's sort of a milestone, right?
My heavens, yeah.
Look, Ma, we made it.
No one said we'd make it past 7.
That's right. So before we get into the meat and potatoes of today's show, Tom, I want to ask you about a recent shopping trip. And, you know, I was thinking about this the other day. You're sort of like one of those serial vigilante guys where each episode is like a city, like Houston Hellfire or Detroit Massacre. So what's Chicago?
This is the Chicago Wipeout, where I spent way too much money on paperbacks. I went to Chicago, and I want to showcase 2 bookstores there that sell the types of books we enjoy. The first is the Gallery Bookstore, which is on Belmont Avenue in the city of Chicago. It's right at the Red Line Belmont stop. It's a beautiful store. It's been there for, about 20 years now, and the owner's always threatening to close it down, but he hasn't yet. The owner's I guess he's about 63-year-old guy. I don't know his name. I talked to him, and he never seems to remember me when I come back every year to Chicago. But he has a very strict no cell phones rule when you walk in there. But once you actually comply with that no cell phones rule and turn your cell phone off, then he's a super nice guy. He's a beautiful selection. The prices are rather high there, but the prices are also based on the condition of the paperbacks. Against my better judgment, I spent too much money and bought a bunch of paperbacks. I bought several books in the Sean Ryan spy series by Brian Cleave. It's supposed to be a violent UK spy series I've heard good things about. I bought The Expurgator by Andrew York, which is part of his Jonas Wilde series. I bought a Fawcett Gold Medal paperback called I Have Gloria Kirby by Richard Himmel, which is part of his Johnny Maguire series. In Dangerous Johnny Maguire is back in a hurricane of guys, gals, and guns. And that was about it for that shop. And then I went down a little bit south to the neighborhood of Bucktown or Wicker Park at the Damon Blue Line to Myopic Books. Now, you should check out Myopic Books when you're there. You walk in, and there's a vintage paperback section right when you walk in on a shelf by the floor. I think those are too expensive for my money. The real action is downstairs in the basement of the place, where they have paperbacks in the mystery, adventure, and science fiction genres. They had a bunch of the Black Lizard trade paperbacks of Jim Thompson books. They also had the Black Lizard mass market books by Charles Willeford. I picked up Pickup and Cockfighter. They had a movie tie-in called The Seven Ups by Richard Posner, which is an NYPD book. I believe the movie starred Roy Scheider. They had Man from U.N.C.L.E. books, Get Smart books, A-Team, Doc Savage, CADS, CADS, that series. I don't know much about it. Death Merchant. They had the Spider reprints from the 1980s, I think they were, with the kind of muscular blonde Spider, and a bunch of John D. McDonald standalones. So those are my two tips for Chicago book buying. There's also a decent used bookstore up in the Ravenswood neighborhood and a half-price books up in Skokie that I never made it to. So that was my field trip, the Chicago Wipeout.
You know, I was thinking about this the other day. Is there well, because you go all over the country with your work. So is there a series of bookstores or maybe a bookstore in a particular city that you've yet to conquer? What's on your list?
Well, I think I don't know about chains of bookstores. They pop up. I mean, really, I'm really good with the Southeast. I spend a lot of time in Georgia and Florida. I feel like I've gone to every decent used bookstore in Florida. Once you start getting in, when I was in California, in Los Angeles on a trip, I got together with author, blogger, retired police officer Paul Bishop, and he took me around to sort of the best and brightest bookstores in Los Angeles, which were good but not amazing because the rent's so high in Los Angeles. One of the keys to finding a good used bookstore is finding one kind of in the middle of nowhere that has cheap rent, because none of these places, except for half-price books, have figured out the formula to make money. So there's a lot of America left that I intend to cover, and every time I do, I'll hope to talk to about it on the show.
Sounds good. Well, we're going to go to the far, I guess, down under. We're going to go to Australia today because Tom's going to talk to us about Carter Brown, which is an Australian mystery fiction writer. And we've got 2 reviews today. We're going to do Killer Patrol. That sounds awesome, doesn't it? And we're also going to do The Loving and the Dead, which is by Carter Brown. So without further ado, let's let Tom tell us all about this mysterious Carter Brown.
Now let's talk a little bit about Carter Brown. So Carter Brown was a pseudonym for a gentleman by the name of Alan Jeffrey Yates, who lived from 1923 to 1985. He was actually British born at least, but by the time he was writing professionally, he was writing in Australia. And most of his work falls under the category of detective fiction. And he started writing in the 1950s, and his books were published in Australia in kind of digest size. If you could imagine like an old Ellery Queen mystery magazine, the novels looked like that. I had a couple of those. And he was using the pseudonym Peter Carter Brown. But quickly after his books began getting published in the U.S., they became published under just the names Carter Brown. As near as I could tell, there were 322 published Carter Brown novels. And at one point, he had a contract where he needed to produce a book every month for his Australian publisher, a company called Horwitz. He had several different heroes. Most of his books were series books. The most popular hero, I think, was probably Lieutenant Al Wheeler, who was a suburban L.A. cop in fictional Pine County, California. There was Danny Boyd, who I think was a New York private eye. He might have been an L.A. private eye. There was a Hollywood private eye by the name of Rick Holman, another private eye by the name of Larry Baker. There was a woman private eye by the name of Mavis Seidlitz that I'm going to talk quite a bit about when I do my review. And there are a bunch of other series characters that I think took off less and had fewer books: Mike Farrell, Andy Kane, Zelda Roxanne. It was interesting because this was a guy from Australia who began writing books about U.S. private eyes and police officers, in the case of Al Wheeler, these short 120-page mystery novels, before he had ever set foot in the United States. He wrote 30 of his detective novels with American backgrounds before he ever set foot in the U.S., and he chose American settings because he felt that Australians really preferred them. The series got a real boost in the United States when the word was out, whether it was true or not, nobody knows, that President John F. Kennedy was a fan of his books. And they were published in several different languages. If you can think about the numbers here, 120 million Carter Brown books in print. And because he had not spent much time in the U.S., his U.S. literary agent was Scott Meredith, that we talked about, the He was the publisher and kind of brains behind Manhunt magazine. Scott Meredith hired Frank Kane, an author of the Johnny Lydell series, and paid him $500 a book to rewrite them in the early books to make them sound more authentically American. These were short books. He was fond of saying that he did not work from an outline. He made them up as he went along, so he would be halfway through the book just like the reader was, and you'd have no idea, and he had no idea who the actual killer was. If you read a lot of Carter Brown books, you're going to find that they get a bit repetitive. I enjoy them. They're very easy reads. They fly by. The older ones from Signet, when published here in the U.S., were digests with were regular mass market paperbacks, had beautiful painted covers. I think the famous paint illustrator Robert McGinnis did a lot of those. Later on, when we got in toward the 1970s and 80s, they put sleazy photo covers on them. They were also pretty sexy books. They were the original books were sexy in kind of the 1950s and 1960s version of sexy with nothing graphic. But when you got into the 70s and into the early 80s when they stopped, the ones with the photo covers, they got really graphically sexy. And it was said, okay, so let me collect my thoughts here. Stark House, one of my favorite reprint companies, has been reprinting a lot of the early Al Wheeler books. Their first Stark House reprint had a great introduction about Carter Brown. And and I think one of them might have been written by Carter Brown's child or family member or widow, Alan Yates' family members. And what they said is that when the books were sent to Signet in the late 70s and early 80s, to be published with these photo covers, Signet hired editors who added graphic sex scenes into the books that weren't there in the original condition. And so I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what they say, and who am I to call them a liar? Now, here's a bit of controversy and intrigue involving Carter Brown books. There's rumors out there that some of the Carter Brown books, because this guy had a very difficult production schedule with needing to produce one or multiple books a month, according to his contract, and he hated deadlines, and he said that he always felt incredible pressure to produce. There are rumors that they hired ghostwriters to write some of them. There was a guy by the name of C.J. Mackenzie, who was an editor for Horwitz in Australia, who was allegedly commissioned to write 10 of the Carter Brown novels while Yates was traveling in 1958. The source for that is a book called Who's Who, Hoaxes, Imposters, and Identity Crisis in Australian Literature by Maggie Dolan and Carrie Dawson, page 87, footnote 49. There were also rumors, which I think are more interesting, that Robert Silverberg, the famous science fiction author who started out writing a lot of pulp fiction in the crime genre, he may have written 4 of the books. Silverberg does not believe that the 4 books that he wrote were ever published. Now, I think it's possible they were published, but the names might have been changed or they went through heavy editing. Now, Alan Yates' family denies this and says that Alan Yates wrote all the Carter Brown books. There's also rumors out there that a Australian science fiction fan named Ron Brown may have ghostwritten them. I think it's one of those things that we're never really going to know for sure, but it's kind of interesting to speculate, especially somebody who was that prolific. Alan Yates wrote a autobiography called Ready When You Are, CB, the autobiography of Alan Yates, alias Carter Brown, published in 1983 by Macmillan Books. I've not read it myself, but I'm told it's a great autobiography. So my opinion on the Carter Brown series is that they rely a lot on quirky characters. They're good mysteries in general. They're very quick reads. They get a bit repetitive. If you read the Shel Scott books by Richard Prather, you kind of have a taste for what we're talking about here. I think this stuff is literary snack food. If you go to the Paperback Warrior site, you'll see a handful of reviews of Carter Brown books that we've reviewed. Eric, and you did some of those reviews. What are your thoughts on Carter Brown?
So it's interesting, you may not realize this, but the Carter Browns that I read were the Wheeler books, the Lieutenant Wheeler. Here's the funny thing. There are Carter Brown books that cater to the supernatural, like Scooby-Doo campiness. Okay. And I've got well over 50 Carter Browns on my shelf, and I pulled a few. But check this out. So What Killed the Vampire, which is, I guess, sort of like a Vampire in the Night horror comedy thing. The one that I read that I'm actually going to post on paperbackwarrior.com this Halloween is The Lady is Transparent. And surprisingly, it's about a haunted house and a werewolf. There's another one here I've got called The Hammer of Thor, and it runs the same gambit where there's a big abandoned mansion, or maybe this so-called haunted mansion on the hill. There's typically thunderstorms. There's fog. It plays up to the whole gothic bit, and does a really good job of it. But it's a little bit campy, but it's a hell of a lot of fun. I've got another one here, and The Undead Sing, which is about a group of hard rock zombies. They call themselves zombies, but it's fun stuff. But I bet you didn't know that there were supernatural elements.
I did not, and it's interesting that you point that out because it sounds like Alan Yates was drawing from a pulp tradition called the Weird Menace pulps, where the setup in a Weird Menace story in the pulp magazines was basically that something incredibly supernatural is happening that's generally fairly terrifying, and by the end of it, you find out that it's nothing, that it's all very explainable by normal means. So it would make sense, seeing the window of time that this guy was probably a reader and a writer, that he got turned on to the Weird Menace pulps and decided to incorporate some of those type of storylines into the Carter Brown books. One other title I want to point out there is, I mentioned a character by the name of Mavis Seidlitz, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right, but I guess it's a book, so you can pronounce it however the hell you want. Those books are very funny. It's a female private eye character, and I'm going to be reviewing one of those later in the show. She reminds me of a kind of Gracie Allen in the Gracie Allen George Burns bits, kind of outwardly a ditz, but she ends up solving a lot of crimes. There was actually a Mavis Seidlitz and Al Wheeler team-up novel called Lament for a Lousy Lover that I've moved up pretty high on my to-read stack, so I hope to get around to that. Got one other little addendum, but anything else from you on Carter Brown?
It sounds like some of those spooky ones were influenced by Scooby-Doo.
Well, I think Scooby-Doo probably also had the idea. Every Scooby-Doo story is essentially a Weird Menace story where it would have worked if it weren't for you meddling kids, type of thing.
Right.
So when I was doing some homework on Horwitz, the publisher, I got a very nice email from a Paperback Warrior reader by the name of Graham from Australia. I don't want to use his last name because I haven't been permission, but he wanted to recommend a Horwitz author by the name of J.E. McDonnell, who is Australia's greatest novelist of the sea. That was on his covers. He also wrote some of the Mark Hood books by James Dark, I think was the pseudonym he used there. Our listener / reader says that it's enjoyable work. His favorite book by J.E. McDonnell from that era is called The Snake Boats, which was, I guess, made him laugh out loud, and it's just supposed to be really great seafaring novels. I asked him if the books ever became available in the U.S., and he goes, no, but there are Corgi editions that can be purchased. So thank you, and if anybody out there knows of books that we should be turned on to, please let me know, because I'm definitely going to keep my eyes open for work by J.E. McDonnell. Anyway, so that's all I have about Carter Brown as an author. Why don't I throw it over to you for a book review?
Sounds good. And man, did I enjoy this week's review, or this book, I should say. Well, this week we're going to be treated to a review on paperbackwarrior.com for a men's action adventure book called Blood Patrol. This was the first of two books starring a Army Special Forces captain named Mike Brent, which I'm going to take as a Green Beret. I think Spy Guys and Gals says it's a Green Beret, and it may have said that somewhere in the text, but I can't remember. But the books are written by a fellow named George Fennell, who was a former U.S. Army Special Services security agent, whatever that means. And not alone, a lot is known about George Fennell. I can't find anything out there that suggests that he wrote anything else other than these two novels. Both of these books, both Blood Patrol and today's review, which is Killer Patrol, were printed by Pinnacle in 1970 with cover art that was more like an adventure theme. In fact, Blood Patrol has the saying, as good as Guns of Navarone, which a lot of adventure books had at the time. They really kind of catered to that audience. Pinnacle decided they would reprint both of them again in 1974, but this time they went with the Team Commando look to cater to men's action readers of that time period, which was smart marketing. The first book, Blood Patrol, had Brent and his partner Hans Schmidt battling Russian operatives in Ethiopia, of all places. That one was really fast, it was intense, and it was altogether really good, but I can't say it was excellent, and I'll reflect that in my review this week. be sure to check that out. But the book's sequel, Killer Patrol, is so good. You can read each of these two books as standalones if you wish. They're not really connected to each other at all in terms of story arcs or history. Mostly they're just, 1, 2, 3, go kill kind of action episodes. But Tom, I loved Killer Patrol. I think I may have told you this a couple weeks ago when I was reading it, that if I was asked to introduce men's action to newbies or maybe millennials, I'd entertain providing them a copy of this book. By no means is it like the best the genre has to offer, but it moves quickly. The story's really easy to follow, and it has everything the genre offers in basically just one fell swoop. This one has Brent and Schmidt dropped into Latin America to track down this arms dealer. And this is really cool. The idea is that the guerrilla rebels are using American firearms like the M16 and the M60 in Costa Verde. I might be saying that wrong. Costa Verde. The United Nations is facing backlash because the world thinks that the U.S. is supplying firearms to the guerrillas. But in fact, the guns are being made by those pesky Russians. And they're provided to the fighters in an effort to smear the U.S. name while also maintaining a communist influence in the region. When the book's two heroes start investigating, it really gets bonkers, but in a good way. Think about it. This book alone has an underwater bombing of a submarine, this epic train battle. It has a nautical boat battle. And of course, it's going to have these intense torture scenes where the obligatory hero escapes. And it's even got an aerial battle with this helicopter. In fact, the entire, I couldn't believe this, the entire third chapter is just lovemaking, which is the whole chapter. I mean, this one hits every item on the checklist. If you're wanting something different than the Mac Bolan, the Phoenix Force, Able Team, I can go on and on, Death Merchant, Destroyer, just snag this one down. Again, you can get both, Killer Patrol and Blood Patrol. They're both good in my opinion, but Killer Patrol is probably the more superior one. Definitely just a lot of fun. Have you read that one, Tom?
I have not. I have them both. Here's a question. Is it important to read the first one to understand the setup for the second one?
Not at all. It's they're not connected in any way other than both characters are in the first book. There's no story arc here. There's no back history. It's just, here's two guys with guns, and they're off to save the day.
In your research, did this author write anything else?
No, I couldn't find anything that George Fennell has written other than these two books, which makes me wonder if it's like a house name.
No, because they give him like he's like some guy. Isn't the idea that he's a former spy or former special forces dude?
Yeah, I mean it says on the one of the covers of the book, it says written by a former U.S. Army Special Services security agent.
That just seems so specific. If you were going to make something up for a house name, that would be a pretty brazen move for Pinnacle. So I'm going to go out on a limb and say, based on that, he was a real dude. Probably retired from the government, had a couple books in him, wrote the couple books. My guess is that they probably didn't light the world on fire sales-wise, and then he went off to go be a retired guy.
Yeah, I would say when they came out in 1970, they were catering to the adventure crowd with different covers. That didn't work, so then they reintroduced it again as a marketing strategy towards like the men's vigilante, commando type of genre, and apparently didn't work either because it only lasted two books.
That's crazy. It happens to me all the time where I read a book by an author and find out that was his only book, or he only wrote 2 books in a series that never sold. And it's just, you miss what you never had with these guys.
Yeah, it's a real shame because both of those books were good. Killer Patrol was excellent. And you could see on the cover of Killer Patrol, it advertises this as an all-new, exciting series. And it's got a number 2 printed on it, which makes me think that they had big plans for it and it just flopped because of money.
You also wonder if his estate is right now sitting on books 3 through 10 that just never printed, sitting in there collecting dust in some, storage locker.
Lee Goldberg, if you're listening, there you go.
That's exactly what Lee Goldberg's been doing with Ralph Dennis's books, author of the Hardman series. But if anyone can uncover it, Lee Goldberg can. Anyway, so tell me the title and author one more time, just so people have it down.
Killer Patrol by George Fennell. Go get it.
Okay, good. We're going to shift gears now, and we're going to go back to Carter Brown. I'm going to give you a review of his book, The Loving and the Dead by Carter Brown. Okay, to set this up, between 1955 and 1974, we'll call him Brown, even though his name was Alan Yates, authored a dozen books starring a very sexy but very ditzy female private eye by the name of Mavis Seidlitz. They were very funny books. They had a little more humor than I think the other books did. And when you talk to hardcore Carter Brown fans, most of them are going to tell you that the Mavis Seidlitz books are their favorite. Anyway, so The Loving and the Dead was from 1959. It was Carter Brown's fifth entry into the Mavis series. And but like all Carter Brown novels, you can read these in any order whatsoever. There's next to zero continuity in these books. And unlike the book starring Carter Brown's male protagonists, the Mavis books are often very laugh-out-loud funny. And like I said earlier, the patter, I think, was absolutely influenced by the George Burns, Gracie Allen routines. Everyone that Mavis encounters quickly becomes the straight man for her one-liners and double entendres. In this one, in The Loving and the Dead, the setup is pretty simple. I think it was inspired by Agatha Christie books. She has a partner by the name of Johnny Rio, and he sends Mavis to go undercover for a long weekend as the wife of an heir to a great fortune. And the idea is that if this client who has hired Mavis to play his wife, if they can survive the family weekend, he stands to inherit millions of dollars. And so it's one of those novels where a bunch of crazy, rich, eccentric people are trapped in a mansion together, and participants and servants of the family are occasionally murdered, and it begins to narrow down who had done it, and the killer's obviously among them for Mavis to catch. Keep in mind, though, that this is a Carter Brown novel, and the plot is really always just a pretext for kind of sexy, madcap detective work among very eccentric outsiders. And eccentric outsiders are a recurring theme in any Carter Brown book. I think Alan Yates had a very stereotypical view of California, that everybody there is filled with fruits and nuts. It's no spoiler to reveal that Mavis gets laid in this book, but this was written before the novels got extremely sexually graphic for the U.S. consumption. She also has the opportunity to kick ass. There's some decent fight scenes in there, and she does those with her push-up bras and short skirts on. She's just a really likable character. She's sweet, she's tough, she's naive. Everything about this character, I just want to read more about her. My criticism, though, of this novel is that things get a little wacky at times and a little over the top. For instance, there's a character who's a ventriloquist who walks around the whole time with his ventriloquist dummy, and the dummy does most of the talking for him, which I thought is just sort of a dumb element. When Carter Brown is on with the Mavis books, I would say they feel a lot like comedic Donald Westlake novels, like the Dortmunder books. But there's times where it just becomes very farcical and a little over the top for me. Anyway, but you don't read Carter Brown books because you're getting a master's degree in anything. You read them because you're looking for a light, enjoyable crime novel with some laughs. And this one's a fine introduction to this character, and there's plenty there to enjoy. It has about as much depth as as an average episode of Scooby-Doo, but I recommend it if you're looking for something light and insubstantial. And I really enjoyed funny mysteries when I was young, and so kind of taking a break from the hard-boiled, blood-in-the-knuckle stuff to read a humorous whodunit was just a real fun experience for me. And so the book title again was the Loving and the Dead by Carter Brown, and you can find a full written review of this on the Paperback Warrior blog.
Yeah, and that's going to be in our archive section. You can go on the right-hand side, like I mentioned in our opener, and just scroll down to Carter Brown, and you'll see the archives there of the Carter Brown reviews that we have. Tom, was that book released by Starkhouse?
No, that's not a Starkhouse reprint. So far, Starkhouse has been really focused on releasing the Al Wheeler books in release order. And while I appreciate seeing Carter Brown rekindled, and I also appreciate Starkhouse with everything they do, it seems weird to me that you're going to all this trouble to release the Al Wheeler books in order. One, because order doesn't really matter. And two, I suspect that Alan Yates, probably like most authors, got better over time. And so, however, I think there's certainly a market out there among collectors, because I don't think the very early Al Wheeler books ever received U.S. publication. People will correct me if I'm wrong. They always seem to like to do that. But so I could see some value there, but I also think it's also a massive undertaking if they're going to try to print all the Al Wheeler books, because there's dozens of them.
Yeah, exactly. I've picked up some of the Starkhouse reissues of those, and it's cool to have three stories in one collection. But like you said, those are easy to read. They're enjoyable. They're thin, so I think I've got 2 or 3 of them in my glove compartment in my car, just in case.
In case of emergency, break glass. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, they're 120 pages, so as it compared to 180 page Fawcett Gold Medal book or a 900 page modern novel. So they're really novellas, and so he needed to keep it that length. I suspect, one, to please the market at the time, and to keep up with his production schedule, which I guess was just brutal.
All right, thanks, Tom, for the Carter Brown lesson today. But it's the second week of September, and we want to remind you that we've still got a ton of reviews coming at you this month. Remember, each weekday morning, 6 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, we've got a brand new review posted at paperbackwarrior.com. Those reviews will also go on our Facebook feed at the same time. You can post comments at either place. Reviews are coming this month from a ton of great authors. Listen to this: Henry Kane, Peter McCurtain, Charles Willeford, Clifton Adams, Bill Pronzini. So be sure to check those out. Tune into our podcast weekly. New episodes go live every Monday morning, just like this one. I don't know. Tom, I think I've used up all my time for this week. What do you have? Anything left?
Nah, that's all I got. We'll do another episode next week, and we'll have some really neat stuff to talk about then.
All right, well, we're going to sign off. Have a great week.
Be cool.
Bye-bye.